I'm still asking the question and providing answers as to why, after 400 years, African Americans have created no measurable wealth collectively. We were at 1.5% during slavery. Today, we're at 2.9%. That's only moving up in wealth acquisition of 1.5% over a 400-year period. What's the problem? That's the question, and I'm providing answers. Stay with me.
Get ready for a kingdom encounter. The kingdom of God, justice and righteousness. A kingdom encounter. Teaching believers, training leaders, transforming communities. It's a kingdom encounter.
Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to Kingdom Encounter. I'm going to sit with you. I'm going to be the host. I'm going to be the speaker for the next about hour as we continue asking and answering a very important question. A very, very important question. And that is why African Americans have not created more wealth in over 400 years. 1.5% during slavery, 2.9% today. What's the problem? Is it systemic, structural, institutional racism? Or is it black culture? Or is it both? What's the issue? Whatever the issue or issues are, we need to address them so that we can get our share of America's wealth. We're approximately 14% of the United States population. We should have wealth on that level. In other words, 14% of this nation's wealth should be owned by Black Americans. We've been here long enough. We laid the financial foundation for this country. We are as much American as any European person, any Native American person, Asian American person, Arab American person. Why have we not gathered our share of this nation's wealth? It's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate question for a preacher to ask. Don't you think that for the last 7 weeks, I have not been in the Bible? I certainly have. We've been reading as our foundational scriptures from James chapter 5, where James, by the Holy Spirit, challenged people who were wealthy in this world, but who had gained their wealth by cheating and defrauding, robbing other people of their labor. And James pointed out that their cries had reached God's ears. So I'm very much in the book. I'm very much in the Bible and asking this question and providing answers. So this is the gospel, because God is a God of justice and righteousness. His throne, his kingdom is established upon both. Amen. So I told you my purpose for teaching this message is never to create racial strife. You don't need me to do that. That's been in existence since 1619, when the first 20 Africans were brought here and basically enslaved. So you don't need Augustus Corbett to create racial strife. The racial strife was here long before I ever thought about. So that's certainly, don't put that on me. That's not my doing. Okay, racial strife was and has been very much a part of this nation's history. No, my purpose for teaching this is to eliminate confusion among African Americans about this important question, to expose the racist methods whites have used to prevent or to destroy Black wealth creation, and to educate African Americans as to what we can do systemically, what systemic changes we can make to make it easier for Blacks to create wealth. And I've been doing all three of those things throughout this message. Now, last week, I spent a good amount of time talking about the land that African Americans have lost or have been stolen from African Americans. We looked and spent a great deal of time talking about this particular map. This map is very telling, very informative. It says in 1920, there were 950,000 Black farmers. In 2017, there were 35,000 Black farmers. That means 915,000 Black farmers just vanished over a 100-year period, just gone. And gone with them was all that land that we own spread out across the country, primarily in southeast United States of America. So you see the darker colors there from all the way up to Delaware, all the way down to Florida, and all the way over to Texas, and then even some places out in the Midwest, out in the Northwest, Southwest. African Americans own land in these areas. But look at the map in 2017. That was just 5 years ago. And look at how all of that farmland has been taken from African Americans. I talked to you last week about how that happened, how the USDA and the FHA, through racial discrimination, enabled white farmers to basically take African American farmland. They were denied loans. They were racially discriminated against with getting assistance from the federal government. And as a result of that discrimination, African Americans over a long period of time lost a lot of land, farmland, valuable farmland. A lot of it, as you see here, is along the coast. It was along the coast of the United States of America. And today, those are some of the most valuable tracts of land in the country because obviously Americans love the beach, love going to the beach. I love the beach. I was raised up on the beach. And so we have essentially been robbed of all that valuable farmland that today has become very lucrative business developments. And as a result of losing or being robbed of all that valuable property, we in turn were robbed of a considerable amount of wealth. Considerable amount of wealth. So I broke this message down in 3 sections. First, I talked about chattel slavery. For 250 years, African Americans were property under the law. And obviously, you cannot create wealth when you are under the law, the property of another person. That kind of goes with common sense. And that constitutes more than half of the amount of time that we've been in this country. And then after slavery was abolished, the Jim Crow era started, where basically it was another form of slavery. Although slavery had been abolished legally, Jim Crow was basically slavery by another name, one author said. And that system lasted for another 100 years or so. And so in the last 60, 70 years, we have been post Jim Crow, but in a system that I describe as current day systemic racism. Current day systemic racism. And that's what I'm going to focus on this morning. I'm going to show you how current day systemic racism still tremendously hinders African Americans' ability to create wealth in this nation. Now, I always will acknowledge that you have some African Americans who are fabulously wealthy. But again, you can take, I told you this early on, you can take all the wealth of these fabulously wealthy African Americans and it would make a percentage, a small percentage of the wealth of, say, a company like Nike, right? Which we actually spend a lot of money with, buying their $200 sneakers. Or all the wealth of these very fabulously wealthy blacks would make a small percentage of the wealth of a company like Walmart. So just because a few blacks have made some money, right? I was looking at the wealthiest black list recently, the wealthiest African Americans. And yes, you got people like Oprah, you have Robert Smith, a man who's involved in the tech industry, Jay-Z, Kanye West, Michael Jordan, and a few others. But again, take all their wealth together, and it doesn't represent even 10% of the wealth owned by one man. What's his name? Elon Musk. I mean, he's considered the wealthiest man in the world, I believe. And about $200 billion. And so 10% of his wealth would be $20 billion. And all of the black people, all of the wealthy blacks, if you put all their wealth together, I don't think it would exceed 10% of what one white person has in wealth, Elon Musk. So don't think, and then if you come down from those fabulously wealthy blacks, sure, you got some blacks who've been able to, put together some wealth and bravo, and God bless them, and we pray that they create more, right? But don't be distracted by that. As a whole, collectively, Black Americans own only 2.9% of this nation's wealth. And that I got from the Federal Reserve Board. They ought to know. They establish fiscal policies in the country. They are the ones they're the central bank, so they know where the wealth is and who has it. And they attribute that small amount of wealth that black people own, they attributed it to systemic racism. And so, yes, let me just say that I don't believe the issue is black culture. I believe the issue, again, has been 250 years of chattel property slavery, 150 years of Jim Crow, and then systemic current day systemic racism today. There are always issues in black culture that we need to change, that we need to delete and get rid of. But if you change all that, we still will not be able to catch up. The average the average white family has about $200,000, about $180,000, $190,000 in wealth, whereas the average black family has about $23,000 in wealth. So that's a big, big gap that cannot be closed, even if the African American culture just became just pristine and perfect. It still wouldn't close that gap. It still wouldn't make up for all those centuries, those 3.5 to 4 centuries of us being relegated to second-class citizenship under the law, the customs, and so forth of this country. So it is systemic racism today. It was Jim Crow yesteryear, and chattel property slavery the first 250 years of our existence in this country. All right? So I focus so much on land because God isn't making any more land. And the value of a thing is based on how rare it is. Diamonds are considered to be very valuable because they're rare. You don't just walk outside and find diamonds in your yard or at the park, just lying around. I mean, they're rare. And so the rarity of something determines the value of something. And so since land is not growing, there is a fixed amount of land, it has a tremendous amount of property value associated with it. So I focused on it because, again, whoever owns the land in this country are going to have a tremendous amount of influence and will likely control the wealth. You take a company like McDonald's, for example. The most prosperous and valuable part of the McDonald Corporation is not the hamburgers that it sells or those delicious French fries. My wife and I love McDonald's French fries, or the creamy, good tasting ice cream that they're making. Those things are not the most valuable part of McDonald's. The most valuable part of the McDonald's Corporation is the land that the McDonald's restaurant sit on. They own land in some of the most prosperous, most valuable communities. So a McDonald's, for example, in the heart of Midtown Manhattan, a McDonald's on Fifth Avenue, a McDonald's on Rodeo Drive in LA, or McDonald's sitting on the Magnificent Mile there in Chicago. Those land acquisitions by the McDonald's Corporation, that is the most valuable part of its portfolio. And the same is true with these other stores, Walmart, etc. That's what makes them so valuable. And because African Americans because whites have stole our land, it has seriously impaired our ability to create wealth measurably and collectively. And we're gonna look at that. We're gonna look at that this morning. All right, now, where do I want to start? All right, so today I'm going to get into how current day systemic, or you can call it institutional, or you can call it structural racism, how that impacts or hinders African Americans from being able to create wealth. So we need to take a look at what racism is, because a lot of people are confused about what racism is. I was listening to a white pastor the other day, Pastor Ed Young. He's doing a series on woke, what it means to be woke. By the way, let me share an announcement. Pastor Will Gant, my first college roommate, a man I've been knowing 40 years. He and I are planning to do a Facebook Live discussion today on the topic of woke church, because this is a huge topic in the white evangelical church. I mean, they are talking about what it means to be woke. Everything they say, They're talking about woke, woke this, woke that, woke this, woke that, woke this. Look, when the greater, the larger majority white community is talking about something, we need to listen because it's going to result in policies. It's going to result in laws. It's going to result in a certain thinking that's going to have implications for us. So we need to listen. And most likely we need to rebut what they're saying because they're certainly putting a twist on what it means to be woke. I did a video on that. Please go listen to that video and you will see why this is such a dangerous phenomena that's going on right now in our country. All right. So this white pastor, back to Pastor Ed Young. Pastor Ed Young defined racism as prejudging people. Well, look, that is one very, I would say, insignificant way of defining what racism is. It is not the most salient, most significant part of racism in America. And so let's look at why I say that. Let's start by looking at a definition of what individual racism is. There are essentially two types of racism. Let me look at you when I say this. There are two types of racism. There is individual racism, and then there is systemic or institutional or structural racism. Individual racism was what Ed Young is referring to, and that's typically what you're going to hear from white evangelicals and white conservatives. If they even acknowledge any kind of racism, they're going to just acknowledge basically basic individual racism. They deny that there's systemic racism. They deny that there's institutional racism. They deny that there's structural racism. And by the way, let me include in that group not just white evangelicals and white conservatives, but also even black conservatives will also deny that there is systemic racism, structural racism, institutional racism, because sadly, unfortunately, and embarrassingly, many African-American conservatives are basically ventriloquists for white conservatives. I mean, they just basically start repeating the talking points that comes out of the conservative think tanks and the white evangelical churches and Fox News. They just start repeating things without doing their own critical thinking, their own research, their own studying. They just start repeating this stuff. So white evangelicals, white conservatives are gonna restrict their understanding of racism to individual racism, and they're even going to water that down, right? But they're going to stay with individual racism. All right, so I want to give you a definition of individual racism from Dr. James Jones. Dr. James Jones, who wrote a great book. I spoke to him. He's a professor, or he may be retired now, wrote a tremendous book entitled Racism and Prejudice. He's a sociologist with many years of experience studying this topic, knows a whole lot more about it than I do, and most other people. And this is the definition that he has given for individual racism. He says an individual racist is a person who believes black people are inferior to whites because of physical traits. That right there is so important. It is so important, the nuance of what he said. He said that individual racist is, let's go back. I want you to see this. It's very important. is a person who believes black people are inferior to whites because of physical traits. Now, watch what he didn't say. Watch what he didn't say. He didn't say an individual racist is a person who necessarily hates blacks. Okay? I want you to see the nuance. He said an individual racist is one who believes that blacks are inferior. Not that they necessarily hate blacks. Now, you do have some individual racists who hate blacks. Dr. Joel Covell says that there are two basic types of individual racists. One is the blatant racist, and one is the sort of the passive racists, right? The blatant racists, those are the folks who we see on the street corners with their, hate signs and Confederate flags and so forth. These folks, and they go out and commit violence, and they like the dude that shot and killed all the black folks in Buffalo, New York, a few years ago, or Dylan Roof, who murdered the pastor and all those blacks at that Charleston church. Those are blatant white racists. But then there are passive white racists who they would never do something like that, would probably never use the N-word around a black person, but they yet believe that blacks are inferior and that blacks should be relegated to a certain class status, and that blacks should not, be in positions of authority, be in positions of power, live in their neighborhoods or attend their churches. They're not blatant racists, and they would deny, because see, when we say individual racists, and that's why I'm pointing out this nuance, they would deny hating blacks. They would say, I don't hate blacks. If you said that they were a racist, I don't hate blacks. I don't hate anybody. I love everybody, is what they would say. You got friends like that. I have friends like that. I know whites like that. I don't hate anyone. I don't hate black people. But an individual racist is not one who necessarily hates blacks. He or she is one who believes that blacks are inferior to whites. All right? That's a critical distinction, because again, the most whites would say, hey, I don't hate blacks, but I don't want them in my neighborhood. Why? Because I think they're inferior. I don't want them in my kids' schools. Why? Because they're thinking that blacks are inferior. You follow me? All right, let's go back. An individual racist is a person who believes black people are inferior to whites because of physical traits. In other words, we don't have the same brain capacity as they do. All right. This person further believes that these physical traits are determinants of social behavior and of moral or intellectual qualities, and ultimately presumes that this inferiority is a legitimate basis for that group's inferior social status. Now, you know that is exactly a proper and correct description of a whole lot of white people. Okay? They are individual racists in that they consider blacks to be inferior. They're nice. Some of them are very nice. Don't misunderstand me. That's where we get all misled. Well, this is a really nice white person. That ain't got anything to do with it. Donald Trump was a really nice person to all the rappers and the black rappers, the black entertainers, the black athletes that love him. Some of them love him, like Herschel Walker. What's his name? Dennis Rodman. some of the rappers, they rapped about him in his song. Why? Because he was real nice to them. I mean, real nice. I mean, he's a nice, he can be very charming when he needs to be. But oh, wow, that hid that deep-rooted white supremacist, racist ideology in his heart. How do we know it's in his heart? Because we have seen it from his actions as president. We saw how he behaved when Obama became president. He did everything he could to delegitimize and disrespect the first black president. Called for the deaths of the Central Park Five. Called Africa a blank hole country, and it's not a country, but continent, a blank hole, whatever, continent. And said all Haitians have AIDS. I mean, discriminated against blacks in the 70s. I could go on and on and on and on and on. But when necessary, he can be very charming to black people. So don't be misled by charm and niceties. The question is, do they believe blacks are inferior? If so, they are racist. And oftentimes they believe that inferiority is based on the equipment that God has given us. Since I've been doing this message, people have made comments on YouTube, like, for example, very racist comments, like, you know, in answer to my question, why after 100 years blacks have created no measurable wealth collectively, one commenter said, it's the equipment. It's the equipment, meaning our brain capacity. I mean, there are literal books on the shelves out there that saying the black man's brain is not as big as the white man's brain. And so these races, as Professor Jones points out, they believe those physical traits determine our social behavior and our moral and intellectual qualities. And so therefore, they believe that that's a basis for them to be in the superior status in this nation. And an important consideration is that all judgments of superiority are based on the corresponding traits of white people as norms of comparisons. So yes, if they consider people with melanin in their skin, melanated people, to be inferior, then quite naturally, they see themselves as being superior. In other words, the standard, as Professor Jones said, the norms, right, of beauty, the norms of intelligence, right? And it's a lie from the pit of hell. White people are not more beautiful. They're not more intelligent. All that's a lie, a total lie from the pit of hell. Absolutely. From the bottom parts of hell, it is not true. Whites are no more beautiful, no more intelligent than any other ethnicity. All right? You have some brilliant white people, but you also have some brilliant black people. And if you look at the percentage of brilliant black and white people, they're about the same, because God didn't say, I'm going to give the white ethnicity, the European, I'm going to give them an extra dose of intelligence. No. If you believe that, you believe God is a racist. And there is nothing in God's creation, in God's character, in God's word that suggests that God is a racist, or that he would create a racist, a superior ethnicity or group of people. Nothing to suggest that. Even Israel, whom he chose to bring Jesus through, were not and are not superior in any regards. In fact, he said that they were the least, the bloodiest of all people. Look in Ezekiel chapter 18. All right. So an individual racist, again, I want you to keep in mind, is one who believes that blacks are inferior because of our physical traits. And because of those physical traits, our physical traits determine our minds, our subpar inferior minds determine our social behavior. So those people would go into an area like South Dallas, where there's a lot of poverty, a lot of mental health, a lot of mental illness. These individual races would go in a place like that and say that all the poverty, the drugs, the crime, the mental illness that we see in places like South Dallas, South Bronx, South Chicago, all that is the result of the inferiority status of Black people. In other words, Black people behave that way. The Black people are disproportionately incarcerated because of their physical traits, which causes them to behave like animals, which causes them to behave like criminals. The criminal is the one who enslaved the other one for 250 years. The criminal is the one who stole North America. The criminal is the one who colonialized the continent of Africa. That's the criminal. But I still won't go as far as saying that because we've seen a tremendous amount of criminal behavior from the people of European descent, I still won't say that God created them inferior, because I'm not a racist. All right? I'm not a racist. And by the way, me addressing this topic doesn't make me a racist. So I'm not a racist because I don't believe that about other people. I believe God made human beings equal. All of us came from dirt. We have the same blood running in our veins. There is no inferior or superior race. The Apostle Peter, in the Word of God, he was a bigot. He was a Jewish bigot until God broke him down, and he said, Acts chapter 10, you need to read it all the time when you're thinking about this topic. He says, I've come to understand, I've come to realize that God is not a respect of persons. God is not a respect of people. He loves anyone who obeys and who loves him. But that's what an individual racist is. All right. Now, let's talk about the next type of racism, and that is institutional racism. And this is what you must understand in order to understand why Blacks have been able to create very, very little wealth in this nation. All right. The definition, I've cited you three different sources who define institutional racism or systemic racism or structural racism. And their definitions are noticeably very similar. All right, Dr. James Jones, he says, systemic racism are those established laws, customs, and practices within institutions which systemically reflect and produce racial inequities in American society, whether or not the individuals maintaining those practices have racist intentions. Let's read it again. That is so powerful. He says, those established laws, institutional racism, are those established laws, customs, and practices within institutions, banking institutions, hospitals, colleges, police departments, court systems, okay, which systemically reflect and produce racial inequities. So these policies, these laws, these practices, they are what produce racial inequities in American society, not the inferiority of Black people, but it's the customs, the laws, the practices that Black people contend with on a daily basis. It is those things that produce the racial inequities in American society. And they produce those inequities whether or not the individuals maintaining those practices have racist intentions. Now, this is important, folks. This is important because the person who is hiring and firing at your job may not have racist intentions, yet the first fired and the last hired are Blacks. And so if you were to confront that HR person about why there are so few Blacks in management positions and who are making the same amount of money of people who are in it, that person would deny being racist, and maybe even legitimately so. They may be a person who is not racist, but they are following the policies of their company that produces these inequities. You follow me? That's why harboring on racist individuals, focusing on whether individuals are racist or not, is really a waste of time when in terms of addressing wealth disparities and health disparities. We got to get to the root of the issue, which are the policies, the procedures, the laws, the regulations. We don't, shouldn't spend a whole lot of time on whether an individual is racist, unless they're in some sort of position of power over you. But what's in the training manuals? What's being said in the back rooms? What's being said in the boardrooms? What's being said, in the meetings of the upper echelon of the company? What kind of culture is being established, right, that produces these inequities? That's why we have to deal with systemic racism. Now, again, white conservatives, white evangelicals, even many Black conservatives will deny that systemic racism exists. They will deny it. There is no systemic racism. And let me connect this up for you. Critical race theory. One of the basic tenets of critical race theory is that America is systemically racist. That's one of the basic tenets of critical race theory. So there's no wonder why whites have come up so strongly against critical race theory and being woke, because they don't want the truth out. Here's what they say. It's not systemic racism, it is personal responsibility. It is not that there's so much systemic racism in America, but it's that Blacks don't take personal responsibility. I'm going to dispel and debunk that lie, that myth, that charade, that shenanigan. I'm going to do it even in this message right here, okay? I still got a few minutes. I still got about 20 minutes here, all right? I'm going to debunk that. I'm going to show you that that's garbage. I know that's what we hear all the time from the media, that Blacks are irresponsible and so on. It's a lie. Most African American people are hard-working, law-abiding citizens. Don't buy that garbage. Don't buy that. Most Black men are law-abiding, hard-working men. The media and the pundits, they put out a different narrative, And unfortunately, they control the narrative. So it's hard to fight this disinformation. But it's a lie. The issue is systemic racism. The issue is systemic racism. All right, let's go back. Health Affairs Journal. This is a government agency. Here's what they had to say. Systemic and structural racism are forms of racism that are pervasively and deeply embedded in systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, and entrenched practices and beliefs that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment and oppression of people of color with adverse health consequences. So they're touching on the health disparities. But I want you to see how exact, how specific, and how bold they defined what systemic racism is. Systemic and structural racism are forms of racism that are pervasive and deeply embedded. This is not just individuals being racist. This is deeply embedded in the very fiber, in the very systems, in the very institutions, in the culture of America. Of course, whites deny that. But you would be a fool to accept that denial. We're talking about a country that enslaved Black people for 250 years. And then a country that then wrote Black code laws that continue to enslave Black folks for another 100 years. Why would you think that all of a sudden at the 350th year of America's existence, America had a mea culpa moment, had just this, we're no longer systemically racist? You would be a fool to believe that. This thing is too embedded, too pervasive, too entrenched in America's blood system for the nation to just suddenly now to become fair and equitable. That's crazy. The laws have been changed. We thank God there's some progress on that, right? Some Black folks have been able to move out of poverty into middle class. We thank God for that. Other Black folks have even been able to create some wealth, some in the billions. We thank God for that. But when our nation, when Black Americans have only 2.9% of our nation's wealth, after being in this country 400 years, that tells us that systemic racism is still very deeply entrenched in this country. Very, very entrenched and pervasive. That's what the word pervasive means. Widespread. It covers the whole nation. It's not just in pockets. It's pervasive. Let's go back to the definition. Let's look at sociologist Nikki Lisa Cole. She wrote, rooted in a racist foundation, systemic racism today is composed of intersecting, overlapping, and codependent racist institutions, policies, practices, ideals, and behaviors that give an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people while denying these same resources, rights, and power to people of color. Do you notice something common in all of these definitions? Let me point it out to you. just in case you missed it. Dr. James Jones uses the words laws, customs, practices within institutions. Health Affairs talks about systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, entrenched practices. And then Nikki Lisa Cole talks about policies, practices, ideals, behaviors. You see, that's the systemic institutional racism. It's not the individual person. It's the policies, the practices, procedures, the laws, the regulations. You see, sometimes here's what we're learning. We're learning that the laws, pay attention to this, the laws can be racially neutral. The laws can appear on face value to be racially neutral and racially equitable. But there's something much deeper than the laws. There are still the policies, the customs, the practices that oftentimes undermine the law. Yeah, the law says this, but the company still got these policies in place. I see this on a daily basis in my law practice. The law says, Section 1981 of the Federal Code says blacks ought to be treated as fairly as whites. But there are institutions in America who disregard that law all the time because of their policies, their procedures, their customs. And what do we have to do? We have to sue them. We have to drag them in front of a court and make them stop it. And the person who's doing it may be as nice a person as you ever meet, may be as sweet a person as you ever meet. That's where some of you all get all misled because that's what you're focused on. Who was it? I think it was Dennis Rodman said about Donald Trump, ain't a racist bone in his body. Because Trump has been nice to Rodman. I don't care about you being nice to me as much as I do about you being fair and equitable. If you putting a knife in my back, I don't care that you doing it with a smile on your face and whispering sweet nothings in my ear. What I care about is the fact that you got that knife in my back. See what I'm saying? That's institutional racism. That's the problem. Not individual racism. Individual racism is more of an issue for me as a preacher of the gospel, right? So as a preacher of the gospel, I am concerned about an individual harboring racism in their heart because I know it's a sin. And I know that person needs to either become born again or that person needs to have a mind renewal, right? Because there are some, 2 Corinthians 10:4-5 talks about how we get these mental strongholds in our minds. And so some people, some whites and others are raised up in families and homes and neighborhoods and environments where they pick up this learned behavior. We're already born sinners, so we have a proclivity toward sin anyway. So we're raised up hearing our parents say disparaging things about a group of people, then it very likely will become that will become our way of thinking. And so Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12 that we got to renew our minds so that we're not transformed to this world. So as a preacher of the gospel, I understand and I take seriously an individual's racist behavior, or an individual's, whatever sinful behavior. So I'm concerned about that as a gospel preacher. But as an attorney, as an African American man, I'm not so much concerned about that as I am about the systems of oppression, the policies and regulations in these institutions that have seriously impacted African Americans' ability to create wealth. All right, so I hope you understand that. Now, there's so much more I could say about systemic and individual racism, but I want to move on. Let's talk about some of the racist institutions that I have been referring to, right? Let's start first and foremost, as believers, let's start with the one that we know the most about, and that is the religious system in America, all right? Talking about churches, seminaries, Bible schools, Bible commentaries, pastors, preachers, etc. Now, you would think, if you're naive, you would think, well, to be sure, there's no racism in the religious institutions of America. I mean, after all, these people are Christians. These people are Christ-like, and Christ wasn't a racist, so I can. Yeah, that's what you would think. But sadly, it's not the case. Unfortunately, it's not the case. History tells us not the case, because 3 of the largest denominations in our country all supported slavery. Southern Baptist Convention, the Methodist denomination, and the Presbyterian. They were the largest 3. They all supported slavery during slavery. There were ministers, their ministers, their seminaries, their Bible commentaries, they were all in support of slavery. And they were in support also of Jim Crow segregation. Okay? And while they may have acknowledged and issue words of forgiveness for supporting slavery and Jim Crow, many of them today still harbor racist ideology that emanates through their seminaries, their Bible commentaries, their books, their pastors and churches. If you don't think so, go on Twitter and find Reverend Dwight McKissick, who pastors a church here in Arlington. He pastors a Southern Baptist church here in Arlington, Texas. He is probably the most outspoken African-American pastor within the Southern Baptist Convention. And by the way, I attended a Southern Baptist seminary, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. I didn't graduate, but I was there about a year. And I got to know a lot of whites from Southern Baptist, from the Southern Baptist Convention. And let me tell you this, just what I'm telling you. Every one of them that I had personal dealings with were very nice people. Very, very nice people. Tony and I was in seminary, and we were very poor. And there was one time where the motor in our car went out. a Honda Accord that the motor went out and it was like $3,000-$4,000 to get it fixed. We didn't have that money. I was in seminary. And so we were looking at a situation of being without a vehicle. Well, a white fellow seminarian and his wife, he was white, if I recall, I think he was white and she was Chinese, or vice versa. He might have been Chinese and she was white. I can't remember. But they were going on a mission trip for 6 months. And there were other people in our little, apartment community that also needed a vehicle, but they gave it to us. They didn't give it to us, but they loaned it to us while they were on this missionary thing. And I think it was about 6 months. And other seminarians were like, why did you give it to them? But they literally lent us their car. And that's how Tony and I got around until we got our car repaired. So don't misunderstand me. Very nice people. They were very nice. We lived right there on campus in some campus apartments. And these people treated us very well. Very well. Okay? Very well. I'm not talking about the individual. I'm talking about the institution. And the Southern Baptist Convention has a sordid history of racism. I'm not talking about the individual seminarians or the professors. I'm not talking about them. And I'll tell you another thing. If you, as an African American, if you have conservative leanings, if you have conservative beliefs, if you agree with them on a lot of these cultural issues, they will be even nicer to you. Right? I mean, there are black conservatives out there who say everything these white conservatives want them to say, and they roll out the red carpet for those black folks. And give them, I mean, some of those black conservatives are doing very, very well by simply repeating the talking points of white conservatives. Very, very, very well. They are basically monetizing being a black conservative. All right? Not to malign or disparage every black conservative. I'm right of center. I'm conservative on a few issues. Don't misunderstand me. But because I am what one would consider black and conservative, I know personally how they will do if you are in agreement with them on certain issues. But I rejected it personally. As much as I am for righteousness, I am also for justice. And I'm not going to give more heavier weight to one or the other. All right, back to this. It is the institutional, systemic, structural racism that is the problem. And we see it in our religious institutions, not only in the seminaries, but the Bible commentaries. It's one of the reasons why I love Dr. Fred Price, the late Dr. Fred Price. Dr. Price was all up in the higher echelon of white evangelicalism. I mean, he was a featured speaker, specifically in the so-called Word of Faith, charismatic part of white evangelicalism. And I mean, he was celebrated. And, Dr. Price has had his personality, which was abrasive at time, and many people, just took issue with this personality and the things he said and the way he said things. I loved him. Okay, I loved him. We need more. I said it on Facebook. Several people disagree, but I'll say it again. We need more men, more Bible preachers like Fred Price. Okay, why do I say that? Because the man, never a scandal, faithful to his wife, a preacher of righteousness and justice. All his children are God-fearing, saved, spirit-filled believers today. Probably most of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Did tremendous work for the community around his church. Tremendous work. Had all kinds of programs for the community. Yeah, we need black preachers like that. We need more like that. We need more just like that. Okay? Put his abrasive personality aside for a moment. We need more with that kind of substance. They laid the red carpet out for Dr. Price until he challenged racism in the church. For a whole year and a half, he challenged racism in the church. And they turned their backs on him, and many blacks. So yeah, you taught that talk, boy, like my father used to say, they'll go along with you. All right? But you stop talking that talk, you'll become in trouble. Anyway, white Christian leaders provide the theological support and justification for racism. That's important. The real motivation of racism and white supremacy is the money, right? It's about money. Money, then what comes with money? Power. What comes with power? Privilege. But it's money. The love of money is the root of all evil. But how do they live with themselves doing this to people? How do they excuse it? They excuse it from what's coming across the pulpits of white evangelical churches. So the white pastors, and not just the pastors, but again, the seminaries, as well as the Bible commentaries. You know, we've all purchased Bibles that were written by white evangelicals, and then the commentaries where they would give you their spiel on what a verse or chapter of the book says. That's oftentimes where you will find that sort of white-leaning, white supremacist thinking, their interpretation of Scripture. All of that informs, all of that becomes preaching points and talking points of not just white preachers, but even many black preachers. I remember a few years ago, I started wanting to read more about Christ from the African perspective. The African perspective. And I began to start searching. I'm tired of this. Everything I read is written by white evangelicals. I want a different perspective. Because what you look at something through affects how you see it, right? Sometimes I have to clean these glasses because they got dirt on them and I can't see clearly. And I take the glasses off, so I'm like, whoa, I didn't even see that. Put them back on and I'm blind again. And I know the glasses are intended to make me see better, but if there's something on them, you follow me? So white Christian leaders provided theological support and justification for racism. Many white pastors strongly oppose social justice, calling it Marxism, calling it secularism, sinful, etc. That spreads throughout America. Throughout America, you take somebody like Billy Graham, the late Billy Graham. Billy Graham probably was the most influential white evangelical preacher ever in this country. And from some reports, Dr. Graham and Dr. Martin Luther King were friends, were buddies. But Dr. Graham had a certain point that he would not go with Dr. Martin Luther King on the issue of racism. He'd go to a point, but he wouldn't go where he needed to go. He wouldn't go where we needed him to go, because we need people like that speaking to white evangelicals. And I would say more today than ever, what is sweeping and occurring in many white evangelical churches is just really very, very disturbing. Very disturbing. All right, I've gone about as far as I can go now. I got much more. I think next week we're going to be able to conclude this. All I need to do at this point is to show you the racism that are in these institutions. All right, so we're going to look, I'm right now talking about the religious institutions. We're going to talk about the financial institutions. We're going to talk about the medical institutions. We're going to talk about the education institutions. We're going to talk about the home institutions, the home owners or the mortgage companies. We're going to talk about that. And I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you. I'm a lawyer. I don't just say stuff. I mean, I've been practicing law now. In fact, just a few days ago, been 15 years for me, actually in practice, and I actually started studying the law before that. And one thing, we can't get in front of a jury or in front of a judge and just say stuff, just conclusory statements without having some law, some proof, some evidence. We can't do that. So I don't do that. When I say a thing, I'm a support a thing with some evidence, with some receipts. All right? Glory to God. So there's probably one more week of this, and we're going to move on. I think I would have, at that point, proven that it's not Black culture that has hindered Black Americans from creating wealth. Black culture got many things, as do other cultures, that we need to change. Don't misunderstand me. And certainly Black culture may impact individual Blacks from being able to create wealth. But collectively, the issue not Black culture. 250 years of systemic racism, of chattel slavery, 150 years of Jim Crow apartheid, and the last 60 years or so of current day systemic racism. That's the problem. All right, we out. Peace. Love you. Come back next week. Also remember, today, this evening, I don't know what time, let me see, maybe about 6 o'clock. Pastor Will Grant, good friend of mine, and I are going to come on Facebook, YouTube, etc., and we're going to talk about what it means, what woke means. Woke. Because you hear that word a lot now in white evangelical circles. Woke. Well, it's time somebody start responding to what they're saying about woke. And Will and I, we don't have the platforms that Creflo Dollar and T.D. Jakes and other big time preachers have. But we're going to use what we got. We're going to use what we got to talk about this issue. And I don't know necessarily what Will thinks. This may become a debate between us. I don't know. But we're going to talk about it. All right? So I'm going to say today, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. I'd love for you to join us. And I want engagement. If you join, I want you to comment. We may even have some of you call and share your opinion. Today, 6 o'clock. Love you all. God bless you. Peace.